So let's discuss natural law. Good day, everyone. Today we will explore one of the oldest and most influential traditions in legal philosophy, natural law. Now, this theory has shaped not only the way we think about law, but also the way societies justify justice, rights, and morality. We will look at its meaning, philosophical foundation, and its continuing role in law today. Natural law, or jus naturale in Latin, means the law of nature. It is both a philosophical and legal tradition based on the idea that there is a universal moral order woven into the very fabric of existence. Human beings can grasp this moral order through reason. According to natural law, certain truths such as justice, fairness, and respect for human dignity exist independently of written statutes or cultural traditions. Now, these truths are built into what it means to be human. The central principle of natural law is that a law is valid only if it's rooted in morality. This view stands in stark contrast to legal positivism, which says law is valid just because it was enacted by legitimate authority. St. Thomas Aquinas famously summarized natural law with a simple but profound rule: good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. Do good, avoid evil. Now, this moral compass, accessible to human reason, guides how we create and evaluate our legal system. Natural law and legal positivism represent two competing schools of thought. For natural law thinkers, law and morality are inseparable, and unjust law is not a true law. Legal positivists like Austin and Kelsen, however, insist that law is simply the command of a recognized authority, regardless of morality. This raises the classical question: should we obey unjust laws? History, especially in times of dictatorship and human rights abuses, shows the importance of this debate. Natural law is not confined to jurisprudence alone. It bridges law with ethics, politics, and religion, and civil law. It gives us a moral framework for judging whether legal systems are just. However, we should avoid confusing natural law with related but distinct fields or ideas. For example, natural law is not the same as natural rights. Though related, rights are specific claims derived from natural law. It is also different from ethical or metaphysical naturalism, which are separate philosophical traditions about nature and morality. Now let us trace its ancient philosophical roots. Natural law did not just, suddenly appear with St. Thomas Aquinas. It evolved gradually, beginning with Greek philosophy, especially the works of Plato and Aristotle, and later developed further by the Stoics. These ancient thinkers gave us the foundation for natural law as rational, universal, and moral order. Plato never gave us a systematic theory of natural law, but his philosophy set the stage. For Plato, ultimate reality is ordered by eternal forms, and above them all is the form of the good. This good is the deepest source of order, justice, and meaning. In his allegory of the cave, Plato showed that true understanding comes when one escapes illusion and grasps the form of the good. Applied into law, this means that law is not just the product of rulers' whims or popular votes. Law should mirror the rational and moral order of the cosmos. Plato's lasting contribution is the idea that laws must echo a higher rational and moral order. Justice cannot be arbitrary or dictated merely by convenience. Instead, law should reflect an unchanging and eternal reality that gives law its authority. As John Wilde reminds us, Plato's worldview was not morally indifferent. It was filled with purpose and value. In this way, Plato gave natural law its first philosophical foundation. Aristotle, Plato's student, moved the discussion even closer to what we now call natural law. He distinguished between nomos, laws that arise from human agreement, and physis, laws grounded in nature. For Aristotle, there is such a thing as natural justice, which applies everywhere regardless of local customs. He emphasized that a just society cultivates virtue and respects the rational structure of human nature. While he did not create a full natural law theory like Aquinas, Aristotle's framework clearly points toward law as grounded in universal reason. Aristotle saw natural justice as universal. For example, prohibitions against murder or theft apply to all societies, even if specific rules about property or governance differ. He contrasted this with legal justice, which changes depending on culture or agreement. Aristotle thus gave us the first clear articulation that law must reflect universal principles embedded in human nature itself. This insight became crucial for later natural law thinkers. Modern scholars debate Aristotle's place in natural law. Schellens, M.S. Schellens, highlights that his distinction between natural and conventional law is a key precursor to natural law theory. Corbett, 2009, however, warns us not to project Aquinas' later system back into Aristotle. His framework was different. Yet scholars like Jaffa and Strauss argue that Aristotle does point us toward a universal moral standard, even if he never fully developed it. This scholarly debate shows how Aristotle remained central in the genealogy of natural law. The Stoics further developed the natural law tradition. They taught that the universe itself is governed by rational order, what they called the logos. For them, living according to reason and nature was the highest good. They also emphasized the universal brotherhood of humanity, meaning that natural law applies equally to all people, regardless of nationality or culture. This Stoic universalism strongly influenced Roman law and the later Christian philosophy. The Stoics believed the entire universe is ordered by a rational principle called the Logos. All human beings shared in this reason, which makes them capable of discerning right from wrong. To live justly is to live in accordance with reason and with nature. Law, therefore, is not merely a human creation. It is a participation in the rational and moral order of the cosmos. This moved natural law from speculation to a system where every human being participates equally. A striking contribution of Stoic philosophy is its universalism. Unlike the Greek city-states, which often limited rights to citizens, the Stoics declare that all human beings, regardless of nationality, race, or status, are equal in dignity because all share in reason. This principle of universal human equality is what later became the philosophical foundation for ideas of human rights and dignity. The Stoics were in many ways the first to insist that natural law applies to all humanity. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and philosopher, became the most influential transmitter of Stoic natural law. He defined natural law as right reason in accordance with nature, eternal, universal, and unchanging. In his work De Legibus, Cicero boldly declared, if a law is unjust, then it is not truly a law at all. Lex injusta non est lex. This would echo throughout Christian thought, medieval philosophy, and even modern struggles for justice. For Cicero and the Stoics, law is not simply what rulers command. A tyrant may issue decrees, but if they violate reason and justice, they are not laws in the truest sense. Law is grounded in eternal reason, not in the arbitrary will of those in power. This insight laid the foundation for later doctrines of limited government and the idea that unjust governments can be resisted. In fact, many revolutions and reform movements have drawn upon Ciceronian Stoic insights. The Stoic and Ciceronian maxim lex injusta non est lex an unjust law is no law became one of the most powerful ideas in legal philosophy. St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas echoed this in their Christian theology of law. Centuries later, Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the same principle in his letter from Birmingham jail, to defend civil law, to defend civil disobedience, against racist laws. This continuity shows how Stoic thought shaped not only Roman law, but also Christian doctrine, Enlightenment thought, and the modern human rights discourse. The Stoics and Cicero gave us the first systematic and universal vision of natural law. They taught that all humans share in the reason and dignity, that law is not the will of rulers, but the reflection of eternal justice, and that unjust laws are no laws at all. This tradition shaped Christian theology, Enlightenment philosophy, and continues to inspire modern human rights discourse. The Stoics remind us that law must be both rational and moral, or it ceases to be law in the truest sense. Now, the ancient roots of natural law provided the building blocks for later theories. Plato insisted that law must reflect higher truth. Aristotle grounded law in human nature and universal justice. And the Stoics gave natural law a rational and universal character. Now, these contributions paved the way for medieval and modern thinkers, especially St. Thomas Aquinas, who synthesized these ideas into the natural law tradition we know today. Let me leave you with this reflection, this section. Does the principle "an unjust law is no law at all" justify disobedience of unjust laws today? Think of examples in history, from civil rights to anti-colonial struggles movements. This where people appeared to this very principle to resist unjust authority. The Stoics and Cicero would likely say yes, but the question remains, how should modern legal systems balance this with the need for order and stability? Having traced natural law through Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, we now moved into this Christian development. Early Christian drew upon scripture and Greco-Roman philosophy to articulate natural law in the light of faith. From St. Paul to Augustine and finally Aquinas, natural law became a central part of Christian moral and legal thought, shaping not only theology but also Western legal traditions. The earliest Christian echo of natural law appears in St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul wrote that when Gentiles who do not have the Mosaic law still do what is right by nature, they reveal that God's law is indeed written on their hearts. This shows that moral truth is accessible to all human beings, not just to believers. For early Christians, this confirmed that natural law is universal and innate, providing a moral compass that transcends cultural or religious boundaries. St. Augustine deepened the Christian understanding of natural law. He taught that natural law is imprinted in the human heart as part of God's original design for creation. However, after the fall, human beings became wounded by sin. While the moral law still exists within us, our capacity to perceive and obey this is already damaged. Thus, Augustine insisted that we need divine grace to fully live out the natural law. This integration of theology and morality made natural law both universal and deeply Christian. St. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval scholastic, gave us the most systematic Christian account of natural law. In his Summa Theologica, he defined natural law as the rational creature's participation in the eternal law. At its core is a simple but profound directive. Good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. Do good, avoid evil. From this principle flow the fundamental duties of human life, such as preserving life, educating the young, seeking truth, and fostering justice and community. For Aquinas, natural law reflects both reason and divine order. Aquinas distinguished between natural law and human law. Human laws are valid only if they reflect the deeper demands of natural law. Otherwise, they are not laws at all, but in Aquinas' words, acts of violence. This radical view meant that unjust governments or rulers who pass laws contrary to justice lose their moral authority. Centuries later, this teaching would inspire civil disobedience movements and arguments for resisting tyranny. Aquinas thus stands as a bridge between classical natural law and modern human rights tradition. St. Paul affirmed the universality of natural laws, God's law inscribed in every heart. St. Augustine emphasized its divine origin and the necessity of grace to live natural law out. Finally, Aquinas provided a full synthesis, combining reason, morality, and theology into a systematic natural law theory. Their legacy continues to shape Catholic moral theology, Western legal tradition, and modern human rights discourse. Now, let's have this reflective question. If Aquinas is right that unjust laws are not laws but acts of violence, how should Christians and citizens today respond when governments pass unjust or oppressive statutes? Should we obey for the sake of order or resist for the sake of justice? This is the enduring tension at the heart of natural law in Christian thought. After the medieval period of Aquinas, natural law thought did not remain static. During the Renaissance and the early modern period, new challenges emerged, such as European colonization, economic development, and church reform. Natural law was revived and adapted to meet these new realities, especially by the School of Salamanca in Spain and Richard Hooker in England. These thinkers kept natural law relevant, applying it to issues of human rights, economics, and governance. The School of Salamanca, led by theologians and jurists in Spain, brought Aquinas' natural law into conversation with the pressing issues of the 16th century. They asked, what are the rights of indigenous peoples encountered during colonization? How should Christian nations act in economics and international relations? Their answers reflected a deep commitment to natural law as a universal moral order, one that binds not only Europeans but all people of the world. Now let's have Fray Francisco de Vitoria. Is one of the leading figures, argued that indigenous peoples of the Americas were fully human and therefore had natural rights, simply by virtue of their rationality. He insisted that they could not be enslaved or deprived of property just because they were not Christians. This was groundbreaking because it extended natural law universally beyond Christendom. Vitoria's thought became a precursor to international law and the recognition of human dignity as inherent to all people. Then we also have Fray Domingo de Soto and economic justice. Domingo de Soto, another Salamanca scholar, applied natural law principles to economics. He argued that property rights, contracts, and trade must be governed by fairness and justice, not exploitation. This was an early form of economic ethics rooted in natural law, insisting that markets must serve human dignity rather than undermine it. De Soto's work shows how flexible natural law was, capable of guiding not only politics and morality, but also economics. Across Europe, in England, Richard Hooker integrated Aquinas' hierarchy of laws into Anglican theology. He was an Anglican priest. He emphasized that natural law, accessible through reason, forms the foundation of both civil government and church order. Now, for Father Hooker, reason and revelation are not opposed but complementary, both pointing toward justice and truth. His work ensured that natural law remained central to English political and religious thought, influencing later thinkers like Jean Locke. Now, to sum this section, the Renaissance um, and early modern thinkers kept natural law alive by applying it to new challenges. Vitoria and the Salamanca School extended natural rights to all humans. De Soto brought natural law into economics, and Hooker grounded English governance in natural law. Together, they laid the groundwork for international law, Enlightenment rights theory, and modern emphasis on human dignity and social justice. Natural law, once again, proved to be adaptable and enduring. Now, let's have this reflection. If natural law could be applied in the Renaissance to defend indigenous peoples and insist on fair economics, how should it guide us today in debates about globalization, economic inequality, and human rights? This is where the legacy of Vittoria, de Soto, and Hooker still challenges us even in this 21st century. During the Enlightenment, natural law underwent a major transformation. It became less tied to theology and more focused on individual rights, reason, and political freedom. Thinkers like Locke, Grotius, and Pufendorf developed new ways of grounding law, while Hobbes and Cumberland offered rival visions. Now, this period set the foundation for modern liberal democracies and international law. The Enlightenment saw a decisive shift. Natural law was no longer framed primarily as participation in divine law, but as the basis for natural rights. Instead of being a cosmic moral order, natural law was understood as the source of rights that belong to individuals simply by being human. These rights, life, liberty, and property, became the bedrock of liberal constitutions and modern democracy. Hugo Grotius, a Dutch jurist, is often considered the father of modern international law. He made a revolutionary claim: natural law would still exist even if there were no God. This didn't mean he denied God, but he argued that reason alone is enough to ground moral duties. Grotius used natural law to establish rules for war, peace, and international relations, laying the groundwork for the law of nations and international justice. Samuel Pufendorf built on Grotius, creating a comprehensive system of natural law rooted in human reason. He argued that natural law is compatible with divine revelation, but does not depend on it. This rational system explained duties in family, society, and governments, turning natural law into a structured moral philosophy that could stand in both religious and secular contexts. Then we have Jean Locke, who gave natural law its most powerful political form. In his second treatise of government, Jean Locke declared that all people possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Government exists only to protect these rights. Thus, if a government violates them, the people have the right to resist or even overthrow this government. Locke's ideas directly influenced the American Declaration of Independence and the democratic principles that governments derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Thomas Hobbes offered a radically different interpretation. In his work Leviathan, he described natural law not as a moral truth, but as rulers for survival in the dangerous state of nature. For Hobbes, only a powerful sovereign could guarantee peace. Thus, law comes from the will of the sovereign, not from morality or nature. Hobbes' view undermined classical natural law and helped pave the way for modern legal positivism, where law and morality are strictly separated. Richard Cumberland pushed back against Hobbes. In De Legibus Naturae, he argued that natural law is grounded in rational benevolence, the duty to promote the well-being of others. He insisted that the purpose of law is the common good, not just self-preservation. Cumberland thus defended the older moral vision of natural law against Hobbes's reduction of it to survival and power. The Enlightenment transformed natural law into natural rights, grounding them in reason and applying them to politics and governance. Grotius and Pufendorf secularized natural law. Locke made it as a foundation of liberal democracy, and Hobbes challenged it with a proto-positivist approach. The tension um, between rights and authority, morality and sovereignty remains at the heart of legal philosophy today. Now, let's have this question for reflection. Locke argued that people may resist or overthrow a government that fails to protect their rights. Is this principle still relevant in modern democracies, or has the stability of institutions replaced the need for such resistance? This is one of the enduring debates in political and legal philosophy. We have seen how natural law shaped ancient Christian and Enlightenment thought. Now, we turn to its impact on the English legal tradition, particularly the development of the common law. Here, natural law was not just theory. It became a guiding principle for judges, jurists, and constitutional development, ensuring that law remained bound to morality and reason. In the English tradition, natural law principles deeply influenced the growth of common law. Jurists saw law as more than a royal command. It was bound by higher standards of reason, morality, and justice. This meant even kings could not rule arbitrarily. From medieval jurists to early modern thinkers, English law consistently acknowledged a higher law that both judges and rulers must obey. And we have Henry de Bracton, one of the earliest common law jurists, um, thought that the king himself is subject to law because law is bound by reason and morality. In his treatise De Legibus, he declared that rulers are not above the law but under it. This natural principle, that even sovereigns must submit to higher law, laid the groundwork for constitutional government in England. Now, Sir John Fortescue, in defending the English legal system, argued that its strength lay in being grounded in divine and natural law. He emphasized that laws must reflect justice and be consistent with the consent of the governed. His writings combined political theory and natural law to affirm that legitimate government must reflect both reason and morality. And we have Sir Edward Coke. He's a key figure in common law history, explicitly tied natural law to God's law infused into human nature. In his work Calvin's Case, he declared that even the king is subject to the law because law comes from higher principles, not mere will. Coke's argument in Cases and in Parliament established the idea of the rule of law, that all, including the sovereign, are bound by law. Sir Matthew Hale, another great common law jurist, described natural law as the anchor of all civil laws. He believed laws were valid only insofar as they were consistent with higher reason and morality. For Hale, civil law without natural law degenerates into mere power. His vision firmly embedded natural law into the English judicial tradition as a safeguard against tyranny. So the insistence of Bracton, Fortescue, Coke, and Hale that even kings are bound by natural law helped shape constitutionalism. The higher law tradition influenced the rule of law, the separation of powers, and the limits on arbitrary government. These ideas crossed the Atlantic, inspiring the American Revolution and embedded natural law into the very DNA of modern democracies. Now let's have this reflection. The English jurists thought that even kings must obey natural law. Now, in our time, how should constitutional courts enforce this principle against presidents, parliaments, or other powerful actors? Should they rely directly on natural law or only on written constitutions? Now, this is the enduring challenge of the common law and natural law tradition. Then let's explore how the Catholic Church, through her magisterium, continues to uphold and develop natural law teaching. Drawing on Scripture, the Fathers, and Aquinas, the Church presents natural law as universal, rational, and binding for all people, regardless of religion. It remains a cornerstone of Catholic moral theology and social teaching. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, CCC, affirms natural law as the original moral sense inscribed in the heart of each man and universal in its presence. This means natural law is not something imposed from outside, but already written into the human nature. It is universal, binding on all people in all times and places. This echoes Aquinas, who taught that natural law is man's participation in God's eternal law through reason. The Catechism further highlights the key features of natural law. It is universal, permanent, and unchanging. It provides the foundation for moral rules and civil legislation. While accessible to human reason, the effects of sin obscure our perception of it, echoing Augustine's insight. Thus, natural law finds its fullness and clarity in Christ and revelation. Yet, the Church emphasizes that even apart from faith, anyone can discover and live by natural law through reason. Natural law serves as the backbone of Catholic moral theology. It guides the formation of conscience and the evaluation of human acts. Because it is rooted in reason, it creates a bridge between believers and non-believers in moral dialogue. For Catholics, natural law is not opposed to faith. Rather, it shows the harmony of reason and revelation in moral life. Now, the Catholic Church also applies natural law in her social teaching. From Rerum Novarum of 1891 to Laudato Si 2015, natural law provides the grounding for human dignity, labor rights and economic justice, and as well as the care for creation. Because natural law is universal, it allows the Church to dialogue with civil society and even secular institutions on issues of justice and human rights. This universality makes natural law a common moral language across cultures and religion. In essence, the magisterium carries forward Aquinas' teaching that good is to be done and pursued, and evil avoided. The Church insists that law is written on every human heart and accessible to reason. This continuity shows that natural law is not merely medieval philosophy, but a living doctrine at the heart of Catholic theology, one that unites faith and reason. Today, natural law faces challenges from cultural relativism, which denies universal moral norms. Yet the Church insists that natural law remains the foundation for authentic human rights. In debates about life, marriage, and family, as well as ecological and global justice issues, the magisterium appeals to natural law as a moral compass. In this way, it continues to speak not only to Catholics, but all humanity. Let's have this reflection. If natural law is truly universal, how can it serve as common ground between faith and secular society in facing today's challenges, such as human rights, family life, and ecological responsibility? This is where the Catholic magisterium sees natural law as not just a doctrine, but a living path for dialogue and justice. Now, after tracing natural law from ancient through the church and Enlightenment, we now arrive at its modern revival. In the late 20th century, Jean Finis reintroduced natural law to contemporary legal and moral philosophy with his groundbreaking work, Natural Law and Natural Rights. His approach, known as New Natural Law Theory, draws on Aquinas but adapts the tradition to a secular, pluralistic world. Finis's central project was to revive natural law theory in modern legal philosophy. His book Natural Law and Natural Rights became fundamental and foundational in jurisprudence, placing natural law back at the center of legal debates. Unlike older formulations tied closely to theology, Finis emphasized a reason-based approach. His version of natural law is designed to be accessible to all people, regardless of their religious commitments, making it universal. Finis argued that all moral reasoning is grounded in certain self-evident, basic human goods. These goods are not derived from other values, but are fundamental aspects of human flourishing. They include life, knowledge, play, aesthetic experience, friendship, practical reasonableness, and religion. These goods are universally intelligible to human reason. Everyone can recognize them as worthwhile, even if they disagree about how to prioritize them. From these basic goods, Finis developed a moral framework. Moral rules flow from our obligation to respect and promote these goods for ourselves and others. Law, therefore, is legitimate only if it helps individuals and communities pursue these goods. The state's central task is to foster the common good, which means ensuring that conditions where everyone can reasonably pursue these basic aspects of human flourishing. Among the goods, Finis highlighted practical reasonableness as especially important. It is the capacity to make rational choices that order our lives according to the goods in a fair, non-arbitrary way. For example, one should not sacrifice life or friendship purely for material gain. Practical reasonableness ensures balance, fairness, and respect for the dignity of all persons. This principle connects directly to the rule of law because laws should embody practical reasonableness for the community as a whole. Finis' work inspired what is now called the New Natural Law School. While deeply influenced by Aquinas, this school reinterprets his ideas in light of modern pluralism. They emphasize a universally accessible rational foundation for not morality and law without depending on religious revelation. Other key figures include Germain Grisez, Joseph Boyle, and Robert George. Together, they have advanced natural law theory into debates on bioethics, constitutional law, and human rights. The new natural law theory has had wide influence in applied ethics and legal philosophy. It has shaped arguments for human dignity and rights, influenced constitutional law debates on public reason, and guided Catholic moral thought on bioethical issues like abortion, euthanasia, and marriage. It has also entered global discussions on justice and the common good, showing how natural law remains a living tradition with real-world impact. The new natural law theory has been praised for its rational clarity and universal accessibility. It demonstrates that natural law can speak in secular contexts. However, critics argue that Finis's list of goods may be arbitrary or that his reasoning is overly rigid. Others say it underplays the role of tradition and community. Despite these critics, New Natural Law remains one of the most influential schools of moral and legal philosophy today. Now let's reflect on this question. Finis reframed natural law as a universal, rational moral framework that does not depend on religion. In a pluralistic and often divided world, can this serve as a common language for discussing justice, rights, and the common good? This is the promise and the challenge of the new natural law. So far, we've traced natural law through Greek, Christian, and modern Western thought. But natural law-like ideas are not unique to Europe. Islamic jurisprudence, especially in its rationalist schools, developed principles very similar to Western natural law. These approaches emphasize that human reason can discern right and wrong, and that law must serve justice and the common good. Now let's explore how Islamic legal traditions mirror and enrich the natural law conversation. In Islamic thought, the Mutazilit and the Maturidi schools emphasize that human reason is capable of discerning good and evil. This is strikingly similar to natural law theory, which also grounds morality in reason. While revelation in Islam provides divine law, Sharia, this tradition taught that reason itself is God-given tool to grasp universal moral truths. This balance between revelation and rational morality mirrors the interplay we saw in Aquinas' thoughts. Al-Ghazali, one of the greatest Islamic scholars, identified what he called the Maqasid al-Sharia, the objectives of divine law. He outlined the five universal goods that the law must protect: life, religion, reason, property, and family. Notice the parallels with Western natural law. Both emphasize the preservation of life, the pursuit of truth, the protection of human community. These shared values suggest that natural law-like principles exist across religious traditions. Another natural law-like idea in Islamic jurisprudence is istislah, or appeal to public interest. It means that in areas where the Quran and the Hadith do not give explicit rules, jurists can interpret the law in a way that promote welfare, justice, and the common good. This is very close to the natural law concept that human law must serve the common good and reflect rational morality. It shows how both traditions use reason to extend law beyond strict texts. Now we have Ibn Rashid or Averroes. He played a key role in linking Islamic philosophy with Aristotle's natural law ideas. In his Fasil al-Maqal or decisive treatise, he argued that reason and revelation must not conflict but rather harmonize. This had profound influence, not only in the Islamic world but also in medieval Europe, where his works shaped scholastic philosophy, including Aquinas. Ibn Rashid exemplifies the dialogue between reason and faith that lies at the heart of natural law tradition. When we compare Islamic and Western tradition, we find striking convergences. Both emphasize a higher moral order accessible through reason. Both affirm universal goods: life, truth, community, justice. Both insist that human laws must serve these goods to be legitimate. This parallels reminds us that natural law is not simply a Western or Christian idea, but a universal human intuition about morality and justice. Beyond Islam, other traditions also contain natural law-like elements. In Hindu philosophy, Dharma reflects a universal moral order tied to truth and justice. In Confucianism, Li and Ren provide moral standards rooted in human nature and harmony. In African thought, the principle of Ubuntu emphasizes human dignity and community. This example suggests that the intuition of natural law, that morality is universal, rational, and binding, is deeply human and cross-cultural. Now reflect on this. If Islamic, Hindu, Confucian, African, and Western traditions all recognize similar moral principles, respect for life, dignity, truth, and community, does this show that natural law is truly universal? Or are these simply parallel developments shaped by culture? This comparative perspective challenges us to see natural law not as a Western theory, but as a human inheritance. So far, we've examined the history, developments, and the application of natural law. But how do natural law thinkers actually reason about what is right or wrong? What methods do they use to uncover objective moral norms rooted in human nature? So we will explore the different approaches: philosophical, empirical, theological, and practical, that converge in the natural law tradition. The most classical method is rational reflection. Aquinas argued that natural law is grasped by reason as self-evident moral truths. In his work Summa Theologica, um, he teaches that the first precepts of natural law is that good must be pursued and evil avoided. From this principle, other moral norms can be rationally derived. This method assumes that reason, when properly used, can see universal truths about human flourishing. Another method is empirical observation, looking at human nature itself. Thinkers like Aristotle and Aquinas note our natural inclinations to preserve life, to live in society, to seek truth, and to raise families. These observable tendencies point toward the universal goods. From this, natural law thinkers conclude that moral norms are not arbitrary but grounded in human nature itself. Modern thinkers like Jean Finis use axiological or value-based reasoning. Rather than deducing morality from nature, they identify self-evident values or goods that everyone can recognize: life, knowledge, friendship, play, aesthetic experience, or religion. These goods are intrinsically worthwhile and provide the rational basis for moral rules. This approach emphasizes the intelligibility of values rather than the observation of biological tendencies. Another approach is historical interpretive analysis. Legal philosophers like Lon Fuller and Michael Moore argue that we discover moral principles by reflecting on the history of law and its internal logic. For example, Fuller's idea of the inner morality of law, that laws must be general, public, and consistent, shows that legal systems themselves embody natural law principles. This method relies on interpreting the patterns of legal history and practice. Now, for Christian thinkers, theological reflection is also key. Aquinas rooted natural law in God's eternal law, while the Catechism of the Catholic Church um, describes it as the law inscribed in every human heart. The Bible, such as St. Paul's letter to the Romans, confirms that moral law is universally accessible. While reason alone can know natural law, theology deepens and clarifies it, ensuring harmony between faith and reason. A final method is experiential or practical wisdom. Lon Fuller argued that moral principles emerge through real-life engagement with law and society. By wrestling with concrete cases, such as injustice, oppression, or unfair laws, people developed moral insight. This method emphasizes prudence, lived experience, and the wisdom that comes from practice rather than abstract deduction alone. Although these methods differ whether rational, empirical, axiological, theological, or experiential, they share a common aim: to uncover moral principles that are not bound to any single culture or custom. The goal is to ensure that law is never reduced to power, custom, or mere will, but remains accountable to a higher moral order that serves justice and the common good. In closing, natural law is not just a set of doctrines, but the living traditions of reasoning. It stretches from Plato to Aquinas, from Locke to Finis, and across cultures from Islamic to Confucian thoughts. Its enduring message is this: law must always be accountable to reason, morality, and the common good. That is why, even in modern debates, natural law remains vital. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you all.